Even though Nintendo is a company that usually caters to people of all ages when it comes to creating their games, at times they can stray away from their regular formula and come up with an experience that everyone agrees is difficult. Although, this is an extremely rare occurrence that may not even be intentional during development. After researching the ins and outs of the storied franchises, I thought it'd be an interesting idea to look at some of these outlier titles and showcase the ones that really stand out in their respective series. Here coming up with today's video, about the hardest game in each and every franchise Nintendo has ever produced. If there happens to be more than one per series, then of course I'm going to mention them, and what exactly makes them so tough to complete. Also looking more at regular gameplay and not necessarily focusing on specific modes, if that makes sense. And oh yeah, before we get started here, my name is Copycat, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel, hitting that bell to stay notified when I upload new videos. The first franchise we're going to start off with is the iconic Super Mario Bros. 1 that kicked things off with the first title on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985, where most fans will agree that the Lost Levels entry, also known as Super Mario Bros. 2 Famicom Edition, is by far the most unforgiving platformer featuring our mustachioed man. This game was so hard even for Japanese players, Nintendo quickly pivoted to reskin an already made title that was sort of based on Nintendo mechanics called Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic, as the NES release for Super Mario Bros. 2 in Western markets. This ended up being a smart idea as the game was really too similar to the original release and people would have complained about that as well. This entry is a nightmare, as this one is full of frame-perfect jumps, insanely hidden secrets that you need to find to progress forward, as well as a very limited amount of power-ups and 1-ups to find, meaning you're most likely always going to be in small Mario form, so one hit will cause you to lose a life, which happens more often than not. As a kid, I could beat the first game fine, but I couldn't even make it past certain levels in this Lost Levels entry, where the first time I even ever played it is when it was released on the SNES as part of the Super Mario All-Stars collection, where even my sister, who was a really good gamer at that time, had tons of trouble. But we at least had help from the built-in save feature, which is not present in the Famicom version. Even crazier is that in that Famicom release, you had to beat the game without warping or getting a game over continue screen to even make it to World 9, which is Fantasy World, being extra levels that add to the experience but are way easier than the base game, which is nice. Even crazier is what you have to do to get to Worlds A to D, where you have to beat the game a whopping 8 times in a row without any continues, which is just grueling. Especially as, again, there's no save features on the Famicom system, so you either had to do this all in one day or leave your system on overnight, which in the 80s wasn't always an option, as a kid I remember a ton of power outages and my parents just would turn it off sometimes without knowing that it was getting in the way of your gameplay. Now, in terms of 3D Mario games, I think I'd have to go with Super Mario Galaxy 2 being just slightly harder than the runner-up in Super Mario Sunshine, mainly due to the difficulty ramping up significantly towards the end of the game, as well as the insane requirements needed to unlock every level. In past games, you usually just need a certain amount of stars to open a door or a gate to the next world. However, in this one, things are different and you basically need to collect every single star that you come across to complete it. After you beat the main quest, you're then challenged to get every single green star, which is just bonkers, as there's 3 per galaxy and they're hidden in very tricky spots, so to find them you have to look around everywhere and in some cases might have to restart if you miss them. Once you get all 240 stars, then the Grandmaster Galaxy unlocks, where you gain 2 additional stars there. One for completing things as normal, which is tough as the level is not a cakewalk, and one by beating things with just 1 hit point, really needing to have a perfect run, or else if you die you need to go all the way back to the start. Up next, we're going to look at the Legend of Zelda franchise that also made its debut on the NES all the way back in 1985, where I'd have to say the original version and the sequel that came out after it are the hardest of the series. Let me explain why. First off, not having any ability at all to save, and this first game being quite long, means to beat it you really need to know exactly what you're doing, or else you're going to get stuck multiple times and may have to leave your console on overnight if you can't complete it. As well, parts of this game are not straightforward at all, in that there are multiple secret things that you have to do that you're not exactly told about, and there are a lot of walls that need to be bombed to move forward that at first glance don't look like there's anything there at all. Where honestly, without the help of some sort of guide or a friend who already knows the ins and outs of this world, it's almost impossible to find everything yourself. However, back in the day, you could call Nintendo technical support, and there was a department that would act as a sort of guide for you and help you complete the games over the phone, essentially by walking you through them as you play them, which honestly does sound kind of neat. But of course, nowadays there's internet access available to pretty much everybody, so I guess that's kind of obsolete, and the selection could be a bit behind the times, but I think it's still justified. The second entry, The Adventures of Link, is hard for a completely different reason, in that it's based in a 2D platforming realm with our main character having to fight enemies in a very different game style. This is not a hack and slash title like you might expect, and instead is a very methodical adventure game where your attacks and blocks need to be almost perfect to defeat certain bosses, especially as they can come at you at all angles and in multiple different ways. These are some of the hardest fights, either boss or regular enemies, that you'll see in any Nintendo title. And because you have very limited lives and not that much defense, dying is super easy. I'm actually pretty intimidated by old games that have a big learning curve and difficulty spikes, as I know that the rudimentariness, if that's a word, always leads to a more difficult experience that as a kid I'm just gonna admit I wasn't ready for. Now, as an adult, I rarely return to these old games if I haven't already played them in my life, so I'd love to know in the comments if you've beaten this one and how long it's taken you. Now, in terms of 3D titles from the series, the one that sticks out to me as not only the most difficult, but probably the most stressful, is The Legend of Zelda: The Majora's Mask. The follow-up to Ocarina of Time on the N64, where Link has to save the realm of Termina from the corrupted Skull Kid who wants to cause the moon to fall down to Earth and destroy it. What really just sets this one apart from the rest is the 3-day cycle in which you have to complete everything, only being able to save yourself if you use the Song of Time, although it resets everything back to day 1 and you have to go through the motions all over again. This time constraint means you have to be super efficient in what you need to do to get all of the masks and defeat the Skull Kid before it's too late. And because of this mechanic, I always felt like I wasn't able to explore every corner of the world, which is something I always enjoy doing when I play Zelda / more open world games. In the end, it made this one feel more like a chore than a fun experience, which just adds to the fact why it should be showcased here. Next, I want to talk about a very underrated franchise that might actually be a sleeper for my favorite in Donkey Kong, where in playing every game in the series, I'll still die on this hill that DK64 is one of the hardest. To me, this all has to do with the character swapping mechanic, which ends up being a pain in the butt as you can't progress through different stages regularly and instead constantly have to go back to the tag barrels to change which one you need. What's also frustrating is that you have to unlock each character along the way, meaning that you might see a way forward that you want to take, but can't because you need some sort of specific ability to do so, which can be a bit like how Zelda feels at times, but way more annoying as they're literally everywhere in the stage. The levels themselves are massive and maze-like, with so many collectibles that it almost seems like they number in hundreds per world. And if you want to 100% everything, this demands near total mastery of minigames, boss fights, and precise platforming challenges that rival anything we've seen in Mario. Not only that, but it has some of the toughest boss fights in any game that I might have ever played, some of which require tons of practice to complete, as well as in some cases having to do all of this under a time limit. So as a kid without a guide or some older person helping me out, I totally failed at this and just felt defeated. Now, from what I can gather online, most people don't actually agree with me and instead would pick Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze as their hardest entry, mainly because it demands precise, momentum-based platforming with very little forgiveness. Unlike DK64, which is more of a confusing experience, Tropical Freeze just challenges your pure platforming skills, and at times requires frame-perfect jumps, needing to do all of this while dealing with some of the most annoying enemies you'll ever see. The game frequently puts hazards in some of the worst places, forcing you to make some really tough decisions all while maintaining your speed. Boss fights are multi-phase endurance tests that require strict learning attack cycles, at times deviating from the Nintendo rule of 3, which is weird as almost every single other franchise follows the 3-hit death rule. In the late game, some of the levels remove checkpoints and limit hits, turning some already demanding stages into full no-mistake runs. I'm surprised that it is widely considered one of the toughest 2D modern platformers of all time, but because it is technically in a different realm than Donkey Kong 64, it is really hard to compare the two as they are different styles. But I'll give fans the fact that I did have trouble playing this game when I was an adult. One franchise that always confuses me, as at first glance you think it's for kids, but in actuality, some of its titles have extremely grueling gameplay, in the Pink Blob Kirby and his extensive series, created by legendary game developer Masahiro Sakurai, where after a lot of debate, I decided on Kirby's Dreamland that came out for the Game Boy in 1992 as being the hardest, or at least one of them. Why this one makes this list, especially when compared to later Kirby games, is because it lacks many of the mechanics that make the others forgiving. There are no copy abilities, meaning that Kirby is limited to his inhale/spit attacks and his basic air floating. There's noticeably less health recovery, probably due to how rudimentary the game is. Way tighter enemy placement, again probably due to how small the screen has to be. And boss fights that require constant pattern recognition without much room for error. Again, because you can't inhale enemies, you can't rely on the usual transformations to carry you through tough sections, making this a definite outlier in the series, as it's really not what you would expect from your pink friend. Compared to later entries like Kirby's Adventure, Dreamland just feels stripped down with way more places to die. There's really not much else to say about it. It's a pretty simple title, it's really just hard. And because of all this is why many players will put this on the top of their lists. If you think there's another game that I left out that should be in this video, then please of course let me know in the comments below. The next franchise we're going to look at is Metroid, which stars Samus Aran as its main protagonist, an armored-wearing bounty hunter who explores the galaxy and completes high-risk missions in some of the most dangerous places. Now, in terms of hard games, I'm once again going to mention the first entry, Metroid for the NES, that came out in 1986, which is considered frustrating because of its technical and design limitations rather than its pure gameplay difficulty. This one has no in-game map, which is a huge nightmare as you have to backtrack so many times. And a lot of the rooms themselves look visually identical with only a few indicators of what sets them apart, making navigation very confusing and making it so that it's very easy to get lost. Again, to reiterate, save systems were limited on the NES. But at least this game did use passwords to allow you to get back to certain spots in the game. Although don't get me wrong, it was still a tough playthrough as dying could reset your health to a very low amount, forcing tedious grinding just to safely continue. Not only that, but some enemies were super rough to fight off against, and some hidden passages are nearly impossible to find without bombing random walls, aka needing a guide to move forward. Combine all of this with vague progression and minimal direction, the challenge really comes down to fighting the game's mechanics rather than mastering them. Now, in the Prime subseries, I'd have to say that the second entry, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, is the toughest one made there, as there are a few in-game mechanics that can really trip you up. One is having to move between light and dark worlds, as this constantly drains your health, specifically in the Dark Aether, unless you stay inside the safe zones. Meaning this definitely slows your exploration, which is something that I like doing in games, and adds pressure to almost every encounter you come across. In my opinion, this just sucks the fun out of the game and turns what's supposed to be an enjoyable experience into something tedious and a chore for players, which is never good. Also, ammo for things like light and dark beams are limited, so combat can feel restrictive compared to the first Prime entry and even the more recent ones. Bosses like the Boost Guardian and Spider Guardian are infamous for being super long, high damage fights that demand strict pattern execution with little room for error. Up next is a series that's not technically made by Nintendo, but they do have a huge stake in the company that does in Pokémon. Made by Game Freak, starting with Pokémon Blue, Green, and Red all the way back in the mid-90s. Having over 100 titles to choose from for this video, but in the end, I discovered how hard Pokémon Conquest actually is. This is partially because it plays nothing like the traditional Pokemon RPGs, and instead is a tactical strategy game more akin to something like Fire Emblem, which I'll get into after this. Also, like that, the battles take place on a grid-based map where positioning, movement range, terrain effects, and unit abilities all matter just as much as type matchups. Each warrior can only partner with one Pokemon. Abilities are simplified to a single move, and you can't freely switch movesets just like in the mainline game. This one just includes things that the normal Pokemon player fanbase isn't accustomed to, meaning you have to prepare a lot more for what you're going to do before you just rush into battle. Because it removes many safety nets that the standard Pokemon games have, and replaces them with tactical death and long campaign scenarios, it feels far more demanding and unfamiliar to players than a traditional experience. I really should mention one mainline series game, and it seems like fans have come to the consensus that Ultra Sun and Moon, the 3DS upgraded version of Sun and Moon that came out also for the 3DS, are very hard to complete, upping the ante significantly from those original titles to this weird final product. Here, the same island challenge structure still exists instead of traditional gyms, but there are much tougher Pokemon battles to face off against, forcing players to really focus on their team composition, the levels of their Pokemon, and their specific movesets to win. The majority of trainers and bosses are more optimized than in the original versions, and the game's most infamous fight, Ultra Necrozma, is widely regarded as one of the hardest mandatory battles in mainline Pokemon history due to its overwhelming stats and hard-hitting potential, meaning some of your Pokemon will get KO'd in this fight. I really did look far and wide for something that's comparable to this, but again and again people picked Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon as their choice, usually just citing the demand for more preparation and tactical awareness when compared to most other modern entries. Like I said, the Fire Emblem franchise is up next, which has a weird relationship with North America as the first game here wouldn't be released until the Blazing Blade for the Game Boy Advance, which, believe it or not, is technically the 7th title in the main series, where one of those Japanese only ones is considered the hardest, called Thracia 776. Its difficulty comes from the strict turn limits on many chapters, forcing players to move quickly and efficiently rather than slowly grinding through levels. The capture and rescue system adds an extra challenge, as failing to save a unit can permanently hinder your army or block access to critical items. Enemy AI here is aggressive, often targeting weaker units first, and mini-maps feature high enemy density and difficult terrain. On top of that, Thracia 776 has limited resources, with scarce healing, restrictive weapon durability, and an annoying fog of war mechanic that obscures a part of the map that can leave you very confused, meaning that every decision ends up being high stakes. Coupled with the usually permanent death for fallen units, it also contains some of the most complex layouts in the series. Again, meaning you need to meticulously plan ahead and almost need to know perfect enemy patterns to even complete things. Now, Fire Emblem games are already considered hard by Nintendo's usually family-friendly standards, but for those who play this original title on the Famicom or picked it up way later on the Wii Shop when it came available for download, then they'll know how grueling this specific one is. In the space-based Star Fox series, they debuted on the SNES back in 1993. The hardest game is one that initially was cancelled and would only be released years later alongside the Super NES Classic Edition in Star Fox 2. The difficulty here is due to the game's combination of free roaming instead of linear gameplay like the first one, aggressive enemy AI, and multi-objective missions that force players to constantly balance offense and defense while managing their small amount of lives and health. Also, the graphics just don't hold up at all, and for a game like this not to have an official release until 2017, it really does deter newer fans from trying this due to its rudimentariness, and of course, its difficulty. Also, enemies appear dynamically across the battlefield, so it's not like you can just take a breather and find some space to relax. Also, like other games in the series, failing to protect your bases and allies can quickly snowball into a lost mission. The map level strategy also adds tension, since every decision about where you move your team can determine whether you face a manageable fight or get overwhelmed. Also, for modern players used to forgiving checkpoint systems, Star Fox 2's harsh penalties make it one of the most punishing experiences in the series. And because of its weird release, it's often overlooked in the hardest games discussions. In the very different Animal Crossing franchise, it's a bit difficult to pick what could be considered the hardest due to the very different gameplay. But after doing my research and learning the ins and outs of each title, it's actually the newest New Horizons game that makes this video. Unlike earlier entries, New Horizons introduces an expansive crafting system where players must gather specific materials from multiple sources to build furniture, tools, and infrastructure. Island development requires careful attention to things like overall village happiness, infrastructure placement, and additions to said infrastructure, giving you an evaluation based on how good things are, meaning you have to gain a certain score to move forward. This takes patience, as many rewards and new items are gated behind time-based mechanics that can't be rushed. And if you want to get every single thing in the game, this will take you a long time. While the game is relaxing on its surface, paying Tom Nook hundreds of thousands of dollars over time just gets tedious, as it feels like you're in an endless spiral of debt that you can't get out of even after hours upon hours of play. All of this makes it arguably the most demanding entry in the series for players who want to seek 100% completion. If you do want to get everything, it could take you upwards of 250 hours, and that's not even counting having to wait in real life so that the seasons pass and you can access different items and recipes, which is insane. The final franchise of this video that we're going to look at a hard game from is Pikmin, which at first looks like it would be an adorable kids game, but in actuality, it can be a real nightmare to complete with super tough enemies and some insanely tough objective windows, where I chose to look at both the first and second entries on the GameCube as they're difficult for completely different reasons. In Pikmin 1, there's a very strenuous 30-day time limit which forces players to carefully plan every expedition. So you really have to pick and choose when you're going to explore so you don't stray off track. You have to ensure that you don't lose too many minions during some of the tougher combat foes, and just straight up not spending time inefficiently, which can make it impossible to recover if you do so. On top of all this, the enemy AI is unpredictable, so you have to manage your units constantly, and boss fights aren't any easier as they hit hard and punish mistakes that you might make. Like I said, Pikmin 2 is hard for a different reason, as here there's no 30-day time limit, but instead navigating through the caves are absolutely brutal. These are filled with traps and powerful enemies that can wipe some of your Pikmin out instantly. There are bombs that fall from the ceiling with little warning. Some of these enemies have huge health meters and deal you massive damage, and with very limited resources once you enter these caves, you're bound to fail a few times. Again, your progress depends on careful planning and smart use of each Pikmin type. Although without a guide and how random the caves feel, you're definitely going to have to backtrack, and that will result in you losing a few of your friends along the way. Alright, that's going to be it for today's video, guys. I really hope you did enjoy this one. If you did, please leave a like, comment below if you think I left any games out, and of course subscribe to my channel. I hope you guys all have a good day, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye!